Hello, this is Jacqueline from Jack Knits, and today we're going to knit this beautiful triangular shawl. It's a very simple, easy project to do, knits up really fast. It only comprises of knit and purl stitches and a very few increase stitches, which we are going to learn together. So let's get started. So let's first talk about the construction of this shawl. It is a triangle shawl which has a nice straight edge at the very top of your shawl where that would go around your shoulders. And then it produces this nice triangle shape all the way to the very tip that will end at the very back of your back. So it's a beautiful cape type shawl that wraps around your shoulders. It makes for a lovely shape. And how we're going to do this is actually we will start and cast on our stitches at the very tip of this, or the very center of this flat edge here. We're going to be starting with casting on only 3 stitches. Then we're going to start every right side row by doing increases here at the center of the shawl and also 1 increase at the beginning and end of each row. So every right side row we're going to increase by 4 stitches, and by doing those increases it's going to start formulating this triangle and point. So sometimes it's better if you actually think of it with the shawl upside down. This is where you're going to cast on your stitches, and then your working stitches on your needle are going to be this edge right here. Of course, when you're working on them, they're going to be, flat on your needle, but you'll see when you're working that it forms this nice triangle. Okay, so that's how we're going to work the construction of this. Now let's talk about the materials a little bit. I used here some very bright and bold colors. I will have a description of the yarn and the colors that I use in the description below, as well as a link to them if you'd wish to purchase them. But of course you can choose whatever colors or yarn you like. This is a worsted weight yarn for this shawl. So yeah, be creative. I also did some stripes here with not only with the color of the yarn, but I also alternated between garter stitch and stockinette stitch to help define those stripes a little bit more. Now for your needle, you're going to want to use a long circular needle. I used a US size 8 needle, and this is a 40-inch long circular needle. You're going to want a nice long needle because these are the stitches that are going to be on your needle, and eventually you'll see that there are a lot of stitches that you end up on your needle towards the end. I ended up with over 300 stitches, so I would not go with anything shorter than a 40-inch long circular needle in order to hold all of your stitches needed to complete this project. Okay, so let's get started with casting on the very first few stitches and doing a few setup rows to get us started. Okay, we're going to do the long tail cast on method to cast on, but since it's only 3 stitches, you don't need much of a tail. Let's cast on 3 stitches. Here's our first 1, 2, 3 stitches. You're going to also need a couple stitch markers handy, and our first setup row is going to not only give us our first set of increases, but we're going to place our stitch markers in the appropriate place, so subsequent rows where we're doing increases, we will know exactly where our increase stitches need to be. Okay, so this is our very first setup row. We will start with the very first stitch. We will do an increase already on this very first row, and we're going to do that increase stitch with a knit in the front and the back. So we're going to knit the stitch in the front of the stitch like you would normally knit a stitch, but before you take it off your needle, go around to the back of the stitch and also knit it through the back of the stitch and pull your needle through. And now you can take it off your needle, and you'll see that I have increased that stitch by 1. Okay, now we're going to do another increase, but we're going to do a very simple yarn over for our next increase. Just wrap your yarn, working yarn, around your needle for that yarn over. Now we're going to place a stitch marker. That's going to help us with the stitch increase placement further on. We will do a knit stitch next between our stitch markers. That knit stitch in the middle is always going to be the very center of our shawl. So we're going to place another stitch marker after that. So that center stitch is always the center of our shawl. Now we're going to do another increase, another yarn over, and now we'll end with an increase as well, a knit in the front and the back. Okay, so now we've done 4 increased stitches. There's a lot going on in that very first setup row. We've increased it by 4, and we've placed our stitch markers so we know exactly where we're going to do increases on subsequent rows. Okay, we're only going to do increased stitches on the right side rows. The wrong side row, which is our row 2, is just going to be knitting across. So only increase on the right side. So on the way back, we're just going to simply knit to the marker, slip that marker, knit that center stitch, slip the next marker, and knit to the end. So now we are ready to do the pattern for the rest of the shawl. You'll see here a couple things that we first started with the little garter stitch section. So for this first section, we're going to be knitting on both the right and wrong side row, and then we'll switch to the stockinette section next. We've also will start now with incorporating a salvaged edge. Now that salvaged edge is going to be 1 stitch at the very beginning and end of each row that's going to produce this nice clean edge all the way on the edges of your shawl, which will make a really nice edging. If you'd like a full video on how I do that salvage edge to produce those clean edges, I will have a link in the upper right hand corner as well as in the description below. But it's going to be a knit stitch or a purl stitch and slip stitches that we incorporate at the beginning and end of each row. So let's do that. Let's start now our next right side row. We are going to be doing increased stitches on this row as well and incorporating those edge stitches. So now our increased stitch is actually going to occur on the very second stitch of the start of the row and the second to last stitch on the end of the row. So we're going to start our first stitch with the right side row with a knit stitch. That's going to be our salvage stitch. Now we will do our first increase at the start of the row, the second stitch, and we will do a knit in the front and the back of that stitch for our first increase. Now we will knit to the marker. At this point we only have 1 stitch. Eventually you'll have a lot of stitches between before that marker, but now it's only 1. Knit to the marker, do a yarn over for our second increase. Your yarn over is always going to be the stitch right before your marker. Now we'll slip that marker. The center stitch is always going to be a knit stitch, that center of your shawl. Slip the next marker. And now we will do another yarn over. So you're on the right side row, you're always going to be doing a yarn over at the right before the marker and right after the second marker. Now we will knit till we have only 2 stitches left on the needle. At this point it's only 1 stitch, but again it's going to be many stitches several rows from now. Now we will do our last increase on the second to the last stitch, which is a knit in the front and back again. That's going to be our increase stitch. And then the last stitch, to produce that nice clean edge, we are going to, with the yarn and back, slip our stitch knitwise. Just slip it off the needle to the next. Okay? All right, so that's the first row of our pattern for that garter stitch. Now let's turn it over to the wrong side row, and for the garter stitch we are just knitting all the way across. But first we have to take care of that salvage stitch. So the very first stitch of our wrong side rows, we are actually going to purl that stitch. So bring your yarn to the front so we can purl that very first stitch. Now we'll go back to just knitting across the entire row and slipping the markers as we go. So let's knit to the marker, slip that marker, knit 1 in the middle, slip the marker again, and we're going to knit till the last stitch because we want to do a special salvage stitch on that one. When you have 1 stitch left on the wrong side row, now with the yarn in front, we will slip that stitch purlwise as if you're going to purl. Okay? All right, so those are the 2-row repeat that you will do for that garter stitch section. We're going to do a total of 10 rows for that before we switch to the stockinette. So let me work ahead for those 10 rows of garter stitch section. Then we're going to switch colors and do the stockinette. And then you're going to be able to see at that point how this nice triangle shape is forming. Okay, I'll see you in a bit. All right, I've now done a total of 10 rows plus the 2 setup rows, so it's actually 12 rows for this first section of this garter stitch section, which is the very first little section we have before we're going to switch to another color and do the stockinette stitch. So you can kind of see that it still kind of looks like just a blob of knitting, but if I move my stitches over to the soft part of my needle here, you can kind of see that it is forming a little bit of a triangle. So you've got my straight edge here, and my stitches on my needle are now starting to form the triangle. So and you see the little lacy part of the center where we're doing our increases, and the increases on the edge stitches forming this little triangle. So you can kind of start seeing it take shape. It's kind of fun. So let's now switch to another color and do the stockinette. So I'm going to cut my gray yarn. I'm just going to cut the yarn after each section and then just weave in my ends at the end. So now let's switch over to my kind of my rust color, and how I like to change colors when I do my very first knit stitch. I like to first wrap that end around my pinky a few times. That's going to give it a little stability while I'm knitting those first few stitches, and then, you know, grab the rest of the yarn in my left hand. Okay, so now we can pick up my needle, and we will start with our first row of our stockinette section, which is really the same as the garter stitch, where we're starting the very first stitch with a knit stitch. That's our selvage stitch, and then we're going to do that first increase, that knit in the front and the back on our second stitch of the right side row. Then we're going to knit to the marker, and you see we've got more stitches now, so we've got a little further way to go before we get to our marker, but we're just going to knit all the way till we get to that first marker. And then once we get to that marker, we will do our yarn over. That's our next increase. Slip that marker. We're going to knit the center stitch, is always a knit stitch. Then we're going to slip the next marker, do another yarn over, and now we will knit till we have 2 stitches left on our needle. Two stitches left on our needle, and we're going to do that knit in the front and back again for our next increase, or our last increase. There we go. And then our last stitch is going to be a slip stitch with the yarn and back, slip it knitwise. Okay, so that is our first row with a new color and with a stockinette stitch. We'll switch it over to the wrong side row, and we will now, because it's stockinette, we're going to have to purl on our way back. However, we are going to stick with just plain knit stitches on the stitch right before the marker, the center stitch, and the stitch right after the marker. That's so we can get the same look on this little lacy section in the middle, so the stitches all are consistent looking in the middle. We're going to stick with knit stitches on those center stitches on this section where the rest of the stitches are going to be purl. So let's start this section with a purling all the way to the 1 stitch before the marker. Okay, so we'll be purling each stitch. Okay, when we get to that one stitch before the marker, which is the yarn over from the previous row, we're going to actually knit that stitch instead of purling it. Slip the marker, also knit that center stitch, slip the marker and knit this stitch as well, that slip or that yarn over from the previous row. And now let's go back to purling till we have one stitch left, and then we'll slip that stitch for our salvaged edge. I'm going to pull this a little tighter. That end stitch is going to be a little loose because we switched colors there. But now with the yarn in front, let's slip that purlwise, okay? Now you can tighten up that last stitch a little bit by pulling on those ends a little bit, giving that a little tug. And now that is the first 2 rows complete of our next section. So again, if we move it over to this center of our needle, we can continue to see that nice little pattern develop. Let me work ahead for these next 10 rows so you can really see nicely how this shawl is coming along, and then I'll give you a couple tips for success at the end as well. So how are we coming here? I have completed 10 rows for the stockinette section, and I'm going to keep with that same color for the next garter stitch section, but you can, change colors at this point if you like. You can be as creative as you choose. So we're just going to keep on going with this pattern. We're going to get more and more and more stitches on our needle as we go. I continued and I just continued changing colors, switching with the stitch sections until I had 307 stitches total on my needle, and that produced a really nice size shawl. So you can adjust a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller if you'd like. Okay, now I want to give you a couple little suggestions on how, or tips on how to be successful with knitting this and avoiding a few possible mistakes. If you have trouble remembering which side is your right side and which side is your wrong side, especially in this very first section where it's garter stitch and both sides really look the same, I would suggest that you put one of these little attachable stitch markers on the front of your right side row, just like that, just anywhere in that section. And that's going to help you remember which is your right side row and know which side you're going to be doing your increases on. Also, you're going to want to make sure you remember to do those 4 increases on every right side row. If you forget, your triangle is going to end up being a little wonky because you're going to be missing an increase somewhere. And it can be very easy to forget to do an increase at the very start or end, or maybe the yarn overs in the middle. So it's a good idea to occasionally do a little check on yourself to make sure you have not forgotten in the most recent past. And so what I have done is every once in a while I will count my stitches from the beginning to my stitch markers. It always should be an odd number, and each side should always match. So at this point I've got, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 23 stitches on this side. And I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, and 23 stitches on that side. So because I've got the same number of stitches and they're both odd numbers, I know that I have not forgotten to do increases. But if you notice that your count is off, they're not exactly the same, you might want to frog back a little bit till you do have the same number of stitches. And that's going to make sure that your triangle is nicely, consistently in the right shape. I also recommend that you block your finished work when you are done. That's just a process to just really smooth out your stitches and to make your final shape nice and even. I have a full video on how to do blocking up in the right hand corner. I'll have a link as well as the description below. And then if you need some help or assistance on knowing how to weave in these ends after you switch colors, you'll have all these tails to weave in at the end. I have a video on that as well, on how to successfully weave in those ends so you don't see them and they don't start popping out later. I will have a link in the upper right and in the description below on that as well. So I hope you give this shawl a try. It's a really beautiful addition to your fall wardrobe, and it is just very easy to do and a pleasure to knit. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you like this video, give me a thumbs like, and also don't forget to subscribe. You'll receive future videos on all knitting tips and techniques, tutorials, knitting patterns, and fun knit stitches. Thanks for watching, everybody. Happy knitting.